Hi, welcome to Chapter 5. Today we'll be discussing consciousness. Now this tends to be one of students' favorite chapters because we talk about sleep, dreams, and drugs. So students generally enjoy this chapter because we're talking about things that, as far as sleep and dreams go, most people experience those and most people enjoy those. And drugs can be a taboo topic, so I think sometimes students like talking about them in a college level class. So I'm looking forward to discussing this chapter with you. As always, we'll go over learning objectives for today. Today, the learning objectives are a little bit more broad because we are kind of talking about broad topics here. But first, we will define and describe consciousness. Then we'll describe each of the stages of sleep and kind of the neural mechanisms of sleep. Then we'll differentiate between the theories of sleep because there's quite a few. And then finally, we'll discuss other types of consciousness modifications. This includes things like drugs, hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, etc. So what is consciousness? Consciousness is our subjective experience of the world, our subjective experience of our bodies, and also our mental perspectives. Consciousness is associated with things like sleep and wakefulness, but it includes much more than that. It's our awareness or our consciousness of our internal body processes, right? We're conscious of feeling hungry, we're conscious of feeling thirsty, we're conscious of feeling tired. And it's our consciousness of external stimuli too, right? You're conscious right now, again, that I'm kind of talking to you. You're conscious of being in your room or your office or wherever you chose to watch this lecture. Additionally, it's important to note that sometimes the line between being asleep and awake is blurred, so that line of consciousness is also blurred depending on circumstances. Additionally, alertness and how conscious we are is affected by drug use or even other factors. So sleep deprivation definitely affects our consciousness and our level of alertness. So again, consciousness is about that subjective experience of the world and that being kind of alert and aware of the world. However, there's kind of a lot of blurry room within consciousness because it is affected by, again, things like sleep, drugs, being super hungry or thirsty. So consciousness can be affected by a variety of factors. So let's jump off and start talking about sleep. Sleep is something we all do, but have you ever actually stopped to think about why you sleep, right? Maybe our lives would be more efficient if we didn't kind of waste 8 hours of them. Although sleep is amazing, I really enjoy sleeping, but at the same time, yeah, it's a huge kind of time suck, right? That we're not doing anything. So maybe take a couple of seconds here and think about what your own personal hypotheses of sleep are. And also in that time, please look at this adorable photo of my nephew sleeping on my arm. So cute. What's interesting about sleep is that researchers don't actually know why we sleep. It's not necessarily clear why it happens. So there's a lot of different theories, and each of them are supported by different amounts of evidence. But because by necessity people have to be asleep to study this phenomenon, and that putting people in an experimental setting where they're sleeping isn't totally naturalistic, it's kind of hard to figure out exactly why this is happening. So one of the theories of sleep is that it might be helpful for storage of memories and emotional information. That when we go to sleep, maybe the memories are enhanced and kind of repeated in our sleep, and those neurons and synapses are strengthened, or the connection between neurons are strengthened by kind of going to sleep at night. The next theory is that it's critical for the immune system, right? I'm sure you all have noticed that if you ever aren't getting enough sleep, you're more likely to be sick. So getting enough rest and sleep seems to be pretty important for keeping the immune system up and running. Additionally, sleep might have something to do with promoting insight and problem solving, that sleep might be critical for our cognitive abilities. Additionally, like I was talking about with storage of memories, sleep seems to be important for neural development. Synapses seem to be strengthened in sleep, and whether or not they're strengthened for the purposes of insight and problem solving or the storage of memories and emotional information, seems that maybe neural development is happening when we're asleep. Next is just energy conservation. If we were awake all the time, that's a huge amount of energy expenditure, right? So we'd have to consume a significant number of calories in order to kind of stay awake for those extra hours. And nowadays that'd be less of a problem, but back when we were cavemen, well, that might have been more of an issue, right? We would have to forage and hunt a lot more food. So again, there's different levels of evidence for each of these theories, and it honestly might be all of them. Sleep aids in each of these factors, right? Sleep is related to neural development, it's related to energy conservation, it's related to the immune system. So sleep is beneficial for all of these reasons. So maybe there's not a singular why for why we sleep. So when we talk about sleep, it's important to discuss the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm are any of the cyclical changes that occur on kind of a roughly daily basis, a 24-hour basis, in many of our biological processes. So we have, cyclical changes in our hormone release, in our temperature regulation, and our brain waves also kind of go through cyclical changes. And it's hypothesized that we have, and there's a lot of evidence to show that we have something called a biological clock. So the biological clock is these 20,000 neurons that are located in the hypothalamus, and it's responsible for controlling our levels of alertness. So we have a biological clock for sleep. And these neurons are cued by light and dark. So when it's light, so when it's dark, we'll have kind of an influx of melatonin, which makes us feel fatigued, so we're more likely to sleep at night. And cortisol is released when it's daytime and when we feel more alert. So this is why it's really important for your sleep cycle to be kind of natural. I think there's a lot of people probably, your age, who stay up really late at night and then sleep through the day, and everybody has different sleep cycles, but at the end of the day our hypothalamus is responding to levels of lightness and dark, so it might be a little bit more naturalistic to actually sleep during the light and dark cycles that happen in the day. So if you're having trouble with sleep and you're the kind of person who's a night owl, maybe try kind of cutting back on those late nights. So something that you're probably aware of is that while we're asleep, we go through multiple different stages. So we actually go through 5 stages of sleep over the course of 90 minutes. And then we have multiple cycles of these 5 stages of sleep per night, depending on obviously how much sleep you get. So 4 of our stages are non-REM sleep, and then 1 of our stages is REM sleep. So REM sleep refers to the fact that when we're asleep, our eyes kind of jitter underneath our eyelids, and we call this rapid eye movement. So during this stage, that's when you see that eye tracking pattern. And each of these stages varies in their brain waves, and it will be important for you to know the brain wave that's associated with each stage of sleep. So before we fall asleep, we also have brain waves all the time, right? So again, we measure our brain waves through EEGs when we're awake. So the brain waves that we have when we're awake and aware and alert are these beta waves. And then when we're calm and relaxed, when we're awake, we have alpha waves in our brain. Then in stage 1, which lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, it's the shortest stage, we have theta waves, and these are theta waves here. Stage 1 is associated with very light sleep. It's that stage where you're just starting to fall asleep. The things we experience in stage 1 are hypnagogic imagery. So we experience kind of scrambled or dreamlike images that flit in and out of consciousness. So I don't know how many of you experience that kind of, in between sleep period of time where you might feel as though you're still awake, but you're still having dreams at that time. We also have the myoclonic jerks at this time, the muscle twitches. If you've ever been, also asleep, just about to go to sleep and you feel like you're falling, that's kind of because there's a kind of large muscle twitch. The second stage is stage 2, which lasts about 10 to 30 minutes. And here our brain waves are slower than in stage 1 and also slower than they were in when we were awake. And a characteristic of the brain waves in stage 2 are these kind of sleep spindles and K complexes. This is a K complex over here. And these kind of, bursts of electrical activity are the sleep spindles. So basically what's going on in stage 2 is we are having bursts of electrical activity. Additionally, in stage 2, our heart rate begins to slow, our muscle temperature, our body temperature decreases, right? This is why you get so cold when you're falling asleep. And our muscles begin to relax. So a huge chunk of our sleep cycle is happening here in stage 2. The majority of our sleep cycle is happening here. So there's stage 3 and 4, and these kind of blur together. Stage 3 and 4 have even slower than stage 2, large amplitude brain waves, and these are called delta waves. So children actually spend more time in stage 3 or 4 sleep than adults, which might give you an indication that this might have something to do with growth or neural growth. And these stages are crucial to feeling rested. So if you are kind of woken up and, if you're getting a night of sleep and you hit stage 1 and stage 2 and then are woken up before you fully go through stage 3 or 4, that's when you'll feel extra kind of groggy the next morning. Finally, we have REM sleep, which lasts for about 10 to 15 minutes. And again, it's characterized by the rapid eye movement. In REM sleep, we have a dramatic shift from kind of slow brain waves to rapid low amplitude waves. Again, so these are very slow, and then there's this shift in REM sleep. So the brain waves in REM sleep, even though we're asleep, actually closely resemble those alpha waves from being awake. And we're not totally sure what the function of REM sleep is, but it does seem to be crucial for survival. Again, it's marked by this eye movement and this wakefulness-like brain activity and brain electrical signals. However, the body doesn't really move at all here. And then REM sleep is also where we dream. So although in stage 1, we might have those kind of that blurring of consciousness, we are dreaming in stage 5. Additionally, our heart rate and blood pressure begin to increase, again, kind of resembling that more wakeful state. And we spend more time in REM sleep as the night progresses. So maybe in the beginning of the night when we first fall asleep, we're only spending 9 to 10 minutes. And then, closer to the morning, maybe we're spending more like 15 to 20 minutes in REM sleep. Again, these cycles are about 90 minutes, but 90 minutes is not consistently accurate and will also vary between people. So there are a variety of sleep disorders, right? People have difficulties sleeping, or they have too easy of a time sleeping. So one sleep disorder is insomnia. So insomnia is a disorder that is characterized by a difficulty falling or staying asleep. And I think probably many of us have had at least a bout of insomnia in our lives, even if we don't necessarily have it consistently. So I remember in high school, I, had a full year where it took me 2 hours to go to sleep every night, and I didn't sleep well through the entire night, which it wasn't very great for a, growing kid. So some of you might also deal with insomnia now. And insomnia is a really difficult disorder because it does interfere with our sleep, which is crucial for our, cognitive abilities and also just feeling good. So insomnia is the most common sleep disorder. Again, many of us have probably experienced it at least once, if not chronically. It can be characterized by having either trouble falling asleep, right? So like I did, it would take me, 2 hours at a time to fall asleep, or waking up too early in the morning. So if your alarm is set for 7, but you're waking up at 5 every morning, that happens to me. Ooh, we've got a list error here. 1, 2, and C. And finally, waking up a lot during the night is another version of insomnia where you have to get up a lot. Older people probably technically would count as having insomnia because they have to pee a lot in the middle of the night. So again, insomnia is a disorder that's characterized by, difficulties with sleep. And unfortunately, insomnia is highly correlated with depression, pain, and other medical conditions. Sleep is important, and not getting enough can cause, overeating or undereating, right? Insomnia can be associated with obesity, and it can also be associated with heart conditions. Again, insomnia is associated with depression. Not getting enough sleep is it's not great for your mental health. That's why sleep is so important when we talk about, needing to take care of yourself. Part of that is sleep. Insomnia can be caused by a lot of things. It can be caused by a lot of environmental factors like stress, relationships, a certain medication you're on, being sick. It depends on the type of illness, but sometimes being sick can interfere with your sleep. Having shift work, right? Humans are creatures of habit. Shift work is really horrible for someone's sleep patterns, especially when they're not the week-to-week shift work, when it's, day-to-day. I had a friend in college who was a nurse's assistant, and she would work sometimes kind of 18 hours straight with maybe an hour break because that's how her shift ended up kind of happening. In retrospect, now as an adult, I wonder if that was legal, especially because she was working with patients, but it was something she did pretty consistently. So shift work when it is day-to-day is probably unhealthy for people. Additionally, drinking too much caffeine is associated with insomnia. It's recommended, caffeine stays in your system for 8 hours. So if you're going to bed by midnight, it's best to stop drinking coffee by 4. Additionally, we have anticipatory anxiety before bedtime. So sometimes people who already are struggling with sleeping might feel anxious before going to bed, right? Oh no, now I have to go to sleep, and what if it doesn't work this time? And how many hours can I get before, how many hours of sleep can I get if I fall asleep right now? That anxiety can make cortisol be released. And like we talked about in chapter 3, cortisol is a stress hormone. And again, in this chapter, cortisol is associated with alertness. So that kind of anticipatory anxiety before going to bed can be so counterintuitive, right? So instead of getting the good bedtime hormones of melatonin, you're getting a kind of arousal hormone. So this is part of a recommendation from your book, and I wouldn't necessarily, insomnia can be more complex than this, but if you were struggling with sleep, a lot of people have what we call really bad sleep hygiene, right? You don't do things that really are good for you and good for helping you, get a good night of rest. So a few things that are, good if you've been struggling to sleep to start making changes in your life that could be positive. You'll want to hide clocks in your room, so you're not always doing that thing where you're checking to see, wait, how much sleep am I going to get tonight? Sleeping in a cool room, right? So if it's too hot, you know, we're sweaty, that can really interfere with our sleep. And a regular sleeping schedule, again, that kind of shift work can interfere with our sleep because we aren't kind of fitting into that habit and we aren't kind of teaching our body, you know, we have that internal clock that can be kind of trained to fall asleep at certain times. Additionally, you shouldn't drink caffeine, you know, too late in the day. You also shouldn't take naps, right? You're not getting necessarily a good night of, you're not getting a good rest with a nap. You know, typically you'll wake up before you hit a full cycle. You also shouldn't do anything in your bed that isn't sleeping or sex, really. In your bed, you shouldn't be working, you shouldn't be watching TV, you shouldn't be using your computer, you shouldn't be using your phone. All of those, again, anything that's not sort of relaxing or relational shouldn't be happening in your bed. And this is something that can be hard for people, especially if, you know, we were online right now. So you might be working and watching these lectures in your bed. And I really encourage kind of getting up and moving so that your bed is only associated with sleep and that you really train yourself to feel that way in your bed. The next sleep disorder is narcolepsy. So narcolepsy is characterized by the rapid and unexpected onset of sleep. And for a lot of people, this can interfere with your day-to-day productivity. People who suddenly fall asleep in a meeting, like this poor guy did, if he does have narcolepsy, these people all look way too judgmental. Like the man has a medical condition. You know, it can be, you know, it can interfere with your work. It can interfere with tasks you're doing, and it can also be dangerous, right? If you're cooking when you fall asleep, that you could cause a fire. If you fall down and kind of fall asleep when you're standing, you can injure yourself because it's also often accompanied by cataplexy where you lose your muscle tone. So falling asleep while you're walking to work is dangerous. So I have a video here, and I would recommend watching because it's a video of a person who has narcolepsy, just so that you get an idea of what it's really like. The next sleep disorder is sleep apnea. So this is a disorder caused by an actual blockage in our airway during sleep, which means that we don't get a good night's sleep because we struggle to breathe, and this causes daytime fatigue. So this leads to a ton of health problems, and unfortunately, it can, you know, you're often depriving oxygen to your brain, right? You're really struggling to breathe with sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is most common for people who are obese. However, with that said, although sleep apnea is often likely to start when somebody is obese, it can also cause more weight gain. Again, when people don't get a good night of sleep and they feel fatigued during the day, they end up eating more a lot of the time. So we end up seeing weight gain in people who are already overweight. So there's a few treatments for sleep apnea, including the face masks, you know, those big sleep apnea machines. And this actually blows oxygen into your nasal passage to keep them open. Additionally, if someone is obese and is experiencing sleep apnea, one of the important things that can be done is weight loss. Additionally, if a child is experiencing sleep apnea, it's important to have their tonsils removed. So there are a couple other sleep disorders, including night terrors. These aren't harmful, but they are episodes where people wake up screaming and crying in fear. However, night terrors are different from nightmares because people don't remember them when they wake up. And also people don't always, you know, wake up screaming in terror from their, you know, from their nightmare, but they do from a night terror. Night terrors are most often seen in children. So both my older sister and her daughter experienced, when my older sister was a child, she experienced night terrors, and now my niece has experienced them too in her life, which is, you know, it's kind of scary that children have to go through that. Next is sleepwalking. So this is when you kind of get up and move about in your sleep. Again, this is more common in children. A large percentage of children actually do experience sleepwalking at least once, and it's much less common in adults. So my mom is someone who, if it is completely dark, right, if she ever had blackout curtains in a room, she would sleepwalk. So she actually needs a slight amount of light in her bedroom when she goes to sleep. So when people sleepwalk, they can actually do pretty complex activities. Not every person who sleepwalks will do these things, but sometimes they can drive or get on a computer or cook. So that's an indication that sleepwalking can be quite dangerous. What's interesting about sleepwalking is it doesn't seem to have anything to do with dreams. It doesn't have to do anything with dreaming. So it's not that you're acting out a dream, because these are occurring during non-REM sleep. It's occurring during sleep when we are not dreaming. So that's important to keep in mind. Another type of dream is a lucid dream. Now, this is when you're aware that you're dreaming. So I'm sure that, statistically in this classroom, some of you have experienced a lucid dream or maybe experienced them frequently. I know I've only ever had a lucid dream once in my life, and it was a lot of fun, but I haven't been able to recreate that since. But so in lucid dreams, some people are even able to control their dreams. They're able to manipulate the world within the dream and manipulate the plot line. So there's evidence that this might help people who have nightmares kind of put themselves back into feeling safe or in a safe place, or, kind of change things to be less scary. But there's no evidence that lucid dreams actually help people work through problems. So it doesn't seem that, reconstructing a dream to be less scary actually helps you deal with real life problems. It just helps with dealing with the actual dream. But lucid dreams, the evidence that lucid dreams provide is that sleep and wake might not be so distinct. It might not be this, black and white contrasting phenomenon. Instead, they probably interact with one another. That's kind of what lucid dreams suggest. So just like we're not totally sure why sleep happens, we're also not sure why dreams occur. There are multiple theories, but each of them have their issues that make it so that they probably don't fully explain the phenomenon. So we'll go through each theory in turn and talk about the theory and then the issues that the theory has. So they are Freud's dream protection theory, the activation synthesis theory, the neurocognitive theory, and the dream continuity hypothesis. So first we'll talk about Freud's dream protection theory. Now right off the bat, it's Freud. So that's a pretty good, that'll tell you that we probably shouldn't take this all that seriously. The idea is, the main concept of Freud's dream protection theory is dream interpretation. So Freud believed that when we were having a dream, they were actual work, and he called it dream work. So the idea was that our dreams actually transformed our urges and conflicts that we had in our day-to-day life, and it transformed them into dream symbols. And he thought that when we were asleep, what's happening is that our ego, and again, we'll talk more about the ego, the id and the superego in a few chapters, but he believed that we stopped kind of being able to control our subconscious, and it, kind of went wild. And that the symbols that kind of represent themselves in the dream then would represent wish fulfillment. So we are performing wish fulfillment within our dreams. So Freud thought that one of the roles of a therapist was to then help patients then interpret their dreams and interpret these symbols to reveal their true meaning. And he would distinguish between the manifest content, so the details of a dream, and the latent content, so the true meaning. So it was his job to kind of interpret that manifest content into the latent content. So there are obviously some issues with this, some big ones. First of all, not everybody has dreams. So does this mean that some people are, not performing dream work? Clearly it's not just about our subconscious and needing to work through conflicts within our subconscious, because then everyone would probably have them. Additionally, not all dreams are wish fulfilling. Not all dreams are positive, right? Some of them are nightmares. It's difficult to understand how, again, being chased by a T-Rex has anything to do with with someone's own, not that I have these dreams all the time, has anything to do with somebody's own internal struggle or conflict and what they really want to happen. I don't think anybody really wants to be chased around an island by a giant monster, right? Also, Freud kind of thought, that these are wish-fulfilling dreams from our id, right? Our id is, again, that thing that is responsible for our sexual and aggressive urges. But most people's dreams aren't sexual or aggressive. Of course, people do have sexual and aggressive dreams, but it's not the majority, at least not for the average everyday person. So if it was really our id, as Freud conceptualized it, acting out and fulfilling its own desires, you would think that they would be more consistently sexual and aggressive. However, Freud's response to that concept was just that people just don't remember those parts of their dreams. And if we remember, this is this is a sign that it's a bad theory or a bad hypothesis, because that's ad hoc immunizing. He's providing an escape hatch for himself as for why his theory isn't necessarily holding up. And then additionally, not only is it that not all dreams are about wish fulfillment, but also many dreams aren't about, like, shrouded in meaning. A lot of them are about everyday tasks. So again, there's a lot of people who dream about driving to work, about getting ready for the morning, being late to work, right? Those are just kind of repetitions of what we go through in our day-to-day life, right? There's not really much meaning to having a dream that you woke up and brushed your teeth, right? So there's nothing really to interpret there or any symbols. Next up is the activation and synthesis theory. And the idea here is that our dreams reflect inputs from our brain activation, and that this brain activation originates in the pons. If you remember, we talked about that in chapter 3. And then the forebrain of the cerebral cortex will then try to weave these inputs into a actual story. It'll try to make sense of those random neural impulses. So the idea is that we have this kind of, forebrain and a cerebral cortex that kind of acts as the executive control of the rest of our brain. And then we get, random electrical stimuli, a random neural input, and the, executive functioning part of our brains and the thought-based parts of our brains then try to make sense of that all, try to interpret it into a way that is, kind of usable. But the activation synthesis theory is more that it is just random neural inputs. So there are some issues with the activation synthesis theory, including that damage to the forebrain does seem to eliminate dreams entirely, instead of just kind of making them processable. So this means that the brainstem and the pons is likely not exclusively producing dreams. If it was, then if there was damage to the forebrain, then there would still be dreams. They would just be less interpretable. Another issue is that dreams aren't entirely random, right? There is some plot, there is some story, there is some normalcy, and there's also consistency across time, right? That you can have the same dream multiple times in a row, so it seems as though that's probably not a random neural input that was then interpreted. It seems as though sometimes there is some rationale or logic to them. Next is the neurocognitive theory. This theory rests on the idea that dreams are a meaningful product of our cognitive capacities, and then our cognitive capacities shape what we dream about. So the idea here is that dreams develop over time, both in frequency and complexity. So children actually report significantly fewer dreams than do adults. This suggests that people do develop more dreams over time. However, so they also kind of suggest that complex dreams can be considered cognitive achievements, that children can't have dreams that use complex cognitive skills. So once we master that cognitive skill and it shows up in our dream, we can kind of consider that an achievement of that cognitive skill. For example, adults have the ability to take other people's perspectives and represent multiple people's perspectives at once, and children can't do that. So if we had a dream with multiple characters, all of whom we kind of understood their goals, wants, and motivations, that would be a representation of our cognitive skills, our cognitive achievements. Additionally, with neurocognitive theory, they believe that dreams can allow us to review or address problems within our life. Additionally, they do reflect our everyday experiences. So again, this kind of solves that problem of something like the activation synthesis theory, that we do have dreams that represent our everyday experiences, right? We do have dreams about brushing our teeth, or, I have dreams about bragging about my cast iron pan. That seems to suggest that these aren't just random impulses that need interpreting. They are reflecting our experiences, at least somewhat. There are some issues, although dreams aren't necessarily random, as though they're suggested to be in the activation synthesis theory. There is still an issue of logic, right? Plots jump around, you can break world-bending rules in dreams. So although they're not entirely random, they don't have the logic of the real world. So they do seem kind of removed from our cognitive capacities. Next is the dream continuity theory, and this is just the hypothesis that there is continuity between sleeping and waking experiences, and that dreams then mirror our life experiences. Some issues with this is that dreams do take a life of their own. We do have dreams that go beyond what our life experiences are, right? I have dreams all the time that I can breathe underwater, which is not a life experience that I actually have. Just, people have dreams that they are flying, all of these things that don't really represent continuity between the real world and the dream world. Additionally, if dreams did represent real life experiences, then we would presume that people with certain disabilities, like being deaf and mute, or deaf or mute, or being paraplegic, would have significantly different dreams, but they actually don't have dreams that are significantly different than people without those disabilities. So again, just doesn't really provide the full explanation there of what a dream is. So clearly there's a lot of disagreement between scientists about what dreams actually are. And it doesn't seem as though one dream theory fits the truth. There seems to be a lot of gaps in our knowledge about dreams. However, there is some agreement between scientists. One agreement is that acetylcholine turns on REM sleep. So acetylcholine does seem to play a role in sleep. Additionally, we do know that the forebrain plays an important role in our dreams, given that damage to the forebrain does seem to make us lose our dreams entirely. So next we'll talk about hallucinations. So hallucinations are realistic perceptual experiences in the absence of real external stimuli. Interestingly, the brain will activate in the same way for hallucinations as for a real sensory experience. So if you're having a visual hallucination, your visual pathways will kind of light up. Same with auditory and touch. And that's why hallucinations can seem, so realistic, and they can be so kind of confusing for people. So I'm not sure if anybody kind of listening to this has ever hallucinated, right? There's kind of specific circumstances where somebody would hallucinate, including some people hallucinate in that kind of, in that first stage of sleep, where they actually, hear things that aren't there, see things that aren't there. Additionally, if you've ever had a really high fever or been really hungry or exhausted, or if you've ever done a hallucinogen, you would probably have hallucinated then as well. So hallucinations are quite normal. So it's not just in those situations, but about 10 to 35% of people report having had at least one. So again, it's not just people with disorders like schizophrenia or with drug users, people who used hallucinogens, but it can be brought on by what I was talking about before: oxygen deprivation, sensory deprivation, dementia, migraines, fever, and again, sometimes odd sleep states can bring hallucinations on as well. So if you ever have a hallucination, don't immediately think, oh no, I have schizophrenia or something. There's a lot of reasons why someone could have hallucinations. The next departure from consciousness that we'll discuss are out-of-body and near-death experiences. So in out-of-body experiences, they actually feel as though your consciousness is leaving your body. So out-of-body experiences are apparently quite common, even though there's really no scientific evidence that they exist, that there is some part of you that leaves your body. There's no evidence for that. However, the actual feeling of an out-of-body experience may be due to an actual scrambling of sensory information, and specifically vision and touch, right? Feeling as though maybe you aren't within your body, and losing having your sensory information about your body being kind of scrambled might end up leading to an out-of-body experience. Additionally, there are near-death experiences. So these are out-of-body experiences reported by people who've nearly died or thought they were going to die. And what's interesting about near-death experiences is that they do differ cross-culturally in response to expectations about the afterlife. So some people can have near-death experiences where they visualize, traveling along a river, or some people have near-death experiences where they visualize kind of raising up to the sky. And usually that has to do with one's mythology about what the afterlife looks like, or what the pathway to the afterlife looks like. And that's pretty interesting that each culture has their own kind of hallucinations about what the afterlife will look like. Interestingly, that feeling of an out-of-body experience can be experimentally triggered via stimulation of the temporal lobes and by other means. And additionally, when we kind of have an idea of how near-death experiences are represented neurologically, because when rats are close to death, we actually see changes in their brain, which suggests that there is an actual physical component to these near-death experiences. Next, we'll discuss deja vu. I think everybody has probably experienced deja vu at least once. Deja vu is the feeling of reliving an experience that is actually new. So it's very common. Up to 2/3 of people have experienced at least one episode. I'm surprised that, I was surprised reading that there's 1/3 of the people in the world who haven't experienced at least one. And it seems that deja vu is an anomaly of our memory. So it seems as though that there's something going wrong, or we are kind of having a place in our memory being triggered or stimulated in some way, and that makes us feel as though we are having memory, even though we are in the present. Interestingly, and a little bit scarily, having a prolonged experience of deja vu, so feeling for over like a couple of minutes of, oh, I feel like I've been in this room before, or I feel like I've had this conversation before. A prolonged experience of deja vu for like days or a week may actually be due to a seizure. Maybe due to like somebody having seizures and actual brain issues or malfunctions. Or simply, sometimes events just do resemble past events. Sometimes you do have similar conversations or have been in a similar room. Additionally, sometimes unconscious processing might be occurring, and that's causing this kind of prolonged experience of deja vu. So now we'll discuss hypnosis, because hypnosis is a set of techniques that provide people with suggestions for alterations in their actual perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So hypnosis is actually pretty widely used to help treat pain and things like obesity, anxiety, and habit disorders. And interestingly, people differ in their hypnotic susceptibility. So some people are more responsive to hypnotic suggestions than others. So according to your textbook, about 15 to 20% of people are of high suggestibility. So there's a lot of people who are highly suggestible when it comes to being hypnotized. To compare that, then there's another 15 to 20% who are low suggestibility. And then the rest of the percentage is filled in by people who are kind of in the middle there. So a few myths about hypnosis. It's not actually a change in consciousness. It's not that you completely enter a dream state where you're not aware of the world, because you're just not lost. You don't lose your awareness of your surroundings. Additionally, you won't lose your memory, and your memory won't be enhanced by hypnosis. And really, there's no biological difference, right? We don't see anything really happening in the brain between hypnosis and wakefulness. Take two. Now we'll move into our discussion of drugs and consciousness. And we'll talk about drugs because both legal and illegal drugs produce changes in the state of our consciousness. So psychoactive drugs are similar to, they actually operate in a similar way as the natural chemicals and neurotransmitters within our brain. And then it's important here to remember that lock and key metaphor of neurotransmitters. And a few important terms to remember are agonists, which bind receptors, which they bind to neurotransmitter receptors, and they mimic those neurotransmitter effects. Comparatively, antagonists bind receptors in a way that they block neurotransmitters from binding to them. So they are either, again, the drugs that we're going to discuss are either going to bind to the receptor themselves in order to mimic the neurotransmitter, or they will block neurotransmitters from coming in and producing an effect. So additionally, in order to be effective, drugs must cross our blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is pretty selective about what can cross. And if you remember from chapter 3, the blood-brain barrier is made up of glial cells. So when we take a drug, we have both physical and psychological changes, and this is dependent on the type of drug and then how much of that drug we consume. Additionally, drugs also work through people's beliefs and expectations about their effects, right? There's a little bit of a placebo effect that happens sometimes when people drink alcohol. Here's a funny scene from Freaks and Geeks where they bought non-alcoholic beer, and then everyone at the party ended up pretending as though they were super drunk when in reality they had ingested no drugs that night. So again, people's behavior can change even if the drug isn't necessarily affecting them in that way, because their expectation about the drug is affecting them. So now we'll talk about use, abuse, and dependence, because it's an important topic when we discuss drug use. So substance use is just simply the use of a drug without the physical dependency or negative experiences, right? Not all drugs cause negative experiences. In fact, most of them are positive. That's why people do them. Most of them are positive at least that first time, and that's why people do them. So people are more likely to use substances in early to mid adolescence and early adulthood instead of later adulthood. So I'm sure you guys probably aren't experiencing this semester, but college is a time with a lot of binge drinking and a lot of drug experimentation. So substance abuse is continued substance use in the face of problems and then negative consequences. So if you're binge drinking every weekend and every weekend you are, messing your life up or vomiting or getting in trouble with the police or continue, or continuing to have negative behaviors and negative consequences, that would be considered substance abuse. Additionally, there is substance dependence. So dependence is actually a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms. So people continue to use the substances despite these more significant problems. It's not just you make a couple of mistakes every weekend because you keep getting too drunk, or you're using cocaine way too much and you're continuing to get into fights and have problems with family members. The substance dependence is when you are actually physically dependent on the substance, and then this is what we refer to as an addiction. So substance use disorders actually cause significant impairment or distress with drug use. And substance use disorders involve tolerance and withdrawal. So tolerance is when more of the drug is needed to achieve intoxication, and we'll talk about the specific mechanisms of that in the next couple of slides. Comparatively, withdrawal is when the physical symptoms we experience when use is stopped or reduced. And this is why it's so difficult when somebody is addicted to a drug to kind of stop using that drug, because symptoms can range from anything from like anxiety, right? You stop smoking and suddenly you're having psychological effects of feeling angry and anxious and those types of things. But they can also be pretty severe. You can also have seizures or hallucinations. So it's not recommended for alcoholics to kind of quit, or severe alcoholics to quit cold turkey, because the actual withdrawal can kill you. And there's a few other drugs. I want to say, I don't know as much about all of the different withdrawal symptoms, but I want to say that, benzos are another one of those where withdrawing from benzos is what can kill you. Not just, overconsumption of the drug, but then stopping that drug cold turkey is also dangerous. So some people with addiction disorders need to kind of go on regimented treatments in order, or go to the hospital if they're planning on kind of going cold turkey. Additionally, there's a difference between physical and psychological dependence. So physical dependence is the continued use of a drug to avoid those physical withdrawal symptoms. Again, for physical dependence, typically there are changes in your brain based on the drug that you are taking. Whereas psychological dependence is when the continued use of a drug is motivated by more intense cravings, or by intense cravings instead of just by the physical symptoms. So there are some, and we'll talk about these more in depth, but some drugs create more of a physical dependence than others, but that doesn't mean that somebody can't get addicted to something because it doesn't create the same sort of physical dependence. For example, marijuana is something that people can get addicted to, even though it doesn't have those kind of significant withdrawal symptoms or those significant physical changes, because people can become psychologically dependent on marijuana as well. So when we talk about substance use disorders, there's a few different explanations for why people are more or less likely to engage in substance use or develop a substance use disorder. Some of them are things like sociocultural influences and acceptance of substance use. So there are actually lower rates of alcoholism in cultures where drinking is unacceptable. So somewhere like Japan, from what I understand, they have less of a drinking culture than somewhere like Australia. But Australia has a higher alcoholism rate than somewhere like Japan. So that's pretty intuitive. And then there's also countries where drinking is acceptable, but not necessarily binge drinking. So somewhere like Italy, having a glass of wine at lunch and dinner can be considered normal. But in the UK, in the US, and then in Australia, like I was saying, there's more of a culture around, drinking a lot all at once in a kind of party way, right? That on Friday night, you're not having a glass of wine with dinner, you're having 8 beers and 3 shots. So it's important here to note that addictive personality isn't true. Some people, it's not that some people are just kind of born to be addicts and that they have addictive personalities. But it does seem that there are certain personality traits that might influence us, being maybe more obsessive and feeling as though you have to finish things might be related to addiction, as well as having a low risk aversion. So not being afraid of taking risks also makes somebody more likely maybe to have a substance use disorder. But that's not the same thing as a personality that becomes addicted to things. Additionally, substance use can be reinforced by self-medication. So there are people with, who have issues, coping in the world, and this can either be because of mental illness or because of, real stressors and anxieties, because there's a difference between an anxiety disorder and then having anxiety. But then people can accidentally kind of reinforce that and become addicted to or develop a substance use disorder because they are self-medicating. So again, this is something I know quite a few people who do this with marijuana. Marijuana becomes a way to stop feeling as anxious, and then they need to smoke more and more marijuana to, not feel anxious anymore. And then they are dependent on pot. That happens. The same thing happens with alcohol, and the same thing can happen with any one of the more serious drugs as well. There are also genetic influences. Genetic factors do play a role in our susceptibility to addiction. And it does seem as though one genetic factor, it's not just that genetic factors mean that some people just love alcohol or love certain substances. Additionally, there are genetic mutations associated with an unpleasant response to alcohol. So my brother and sister are good examples of that. My brother actually kind of develops an allergic response to alcohol. So he'll flush and he'll turn bright red whenever he drinks because he doesn't actually like to drink at all. And my sister feels nauseous after about half of a glass of wine. So they both probably are genetically similar. They're siblings. So they probably have, a genetic mutation that makes it so that they respond less positively to alcohol than maybe somebody else who responds more positively. So now we'll discuss the major drug types, and you'll need to know all of the types along with examples of these drug types and the effects that they will have. So we'll start with depressants. Depressants include things like alcohol, barbiturates, quaaludes, and Valium. So depressants decrease the activity in our central nervous system. So I think some people might be surprised when they see that alcohol is a depressant, because for a lot of people, alcohol makes them feel happy and it makes them feel energized and like they could, go out on the town and all of that fun stuff. Not that any of you are drinking. If you're below 21, that's definitely not happening. But it's not that it makes you feel depressed. Instead, it's about that depression of the activity within the central nervous system. So although you also feel an initial high, there is this high is then followed by things like sleepiness. You also do experience slower thought and impaired concentration with any type of depressant. And I'm sure, again, that's an experience that anyone who's drank too much can empathize with. Next are stimulants. So I think most people have probably had at least some experience with a stimulant. If you've drank a cup of coffee, right? Caffeine is a drug, it is a stimulant. So other stimulants include tobacco, cocaine, amphetamines, including something like Adderall, and methamphetamines. And stimulants are kind of the opposite of a depressant, right? They increase the activity within our central nervous system, and they provide a sense of alertness and well-being and energy. Next are opioids. So this, of course, includes heroin, morphine, codeine, and oxycodone. And opioids provide people with, again, it depends on the person, right? There's different genetic factors with how people feel. But generally, opioids provide people with a sense of euphoria and then decrease pain. Again, opioids bind to some of our pain receptors and actually decrease our feelings of pain. Next up are psychedelics. Now, this includes marijuana. And again, not that any of you have ever smoked pot, but that might be kind of surprising because marijuana doesn't necessarily typically produce a hallucinogen. It doesn't typically produce a hallucination. So it kind of feels a little odd, right? That's in this category with LSD and ecstasy and mushrooms. But psychedelics dramatically alter your perception, your mood, and your thoughts. So they provide that psychedelic experience. They don't necessarily completely give you hallucinations, but they are altering your perception. So now we will discuss these drug types in a little bit more depth. So again, first up is depressants. They depress the effects of our central nervous system. And the first and most familiar depressant is alcohol. So alcohol is truly a part of human history. So we've discovered alcoholic fermentation in barrels from over 10,000 years ago. Additionally, alcohol is the substance that is most widely used and abused, right? Alcohol is the substance that has the most substance use disorders associated with it. Again, at low doses, alcohol feels like a stimulant. It elevates your mood, it increases your activity, it lowers your inhibitions. But at high doses, those kind of depressant effects are more apparent, right? You have low muscle coordination, you're more klutzy, your thinking is slower, your memory is worse. Additionally, alcohol increases the effect of GABA, remember the neurotransmitter within the brain, and it increases the effect of GABA, which is inhibitory. So it increases the inhibitory neurotransmitters within our brain. So increasing GABA is one of the ways that alcohol ends up depressing the effects of our central nervous system. The next kind of larger section of depressants are the sedative hypnotic depressants. So sedative is a drug that it produces a calming effect, whereas a hypnotic is a drug that exerts a sleep-inducing effect. So there's three categories of sedative hypnotics. There are barbiturates and non-barbiturates, which include Quaaludes, which were a big drug in like the 70s, and then benzos. So benzos are, similar to Valium in that they are highly addictive. And again, the withdrawal of a benzodiazepine is pretty rough. Again, you can die from a withdrawal from something like this. Next, we'll go into stimulants. Nicotine will be the first one that we talk about in tobacco. Nicotine is one of the most addictive drugs, which is surprising. But smokers report feeling increased stimulation when they smoke, as well as feeling more relaxed. And what it is that nicotine actually increases the effect of acetylcholine, right? So it's an agonist for acetylcholine. And if you remember, acetylcholine is associated with arousal. Next is cocaine, which is probably the most powerful natural stimulant out there. And how cocaine works is it increases dopamine and serotonin activity in the brain. And cocaine produces euphoria, or produces a euphoric effect. And it also produces what feels like an enhanced and mental and physical capacity. So to continue with stimulants, we'll talk about amphetamines, which work through as an agonist for dopamine and norepinephrine. So there are a lot of legal stimulants out there, a lot of legal amphetamines, including something like Adderall, right? It's prescribed for people's attention deficit disorder. But of course, there are also illicit varieties as well. In high doses, amphetamines provide euphoria, along with people not being able to sleep and appetite and losing their appetite as well. Additionally, at high doses, stimulants can increase the level of suspicion and hostility that people feel. Then methamphetamines, which are closely related to amphetamines, which are kind of more powerful versions of an amphetamine, but with the more kind of, the enhanced effects, there's also a higher risk of overdose and dependence on a methamphetamine compared to an amphetamine. The next stimulant is caffeine, which is the most commonly used. And how this works is this blocks adenosine, which is associated with drowsiness. So it actually blocks something in our brain that kind of creates drowsiness, and that's how caffeine's mechanisms kind of work. Next, we'll discuss narcotics, which both relieve pain and induce sleep. So a few of the narcotics are things like heroin, morphine, and codeine, which are all derived from opium or from the opium poppy. So they also produce euphoric effects, but the pleasure is actually pretty limited and short-lived. So the euphoric effects are relatively temporary. The withdrawal symptoms are pretty gnarly. They include sweating, chills, vomiting, muscle cramps. And unfortunately, narcotics like opioids and like heroin are responsible for the highest increase in overdose deaths of all drugs from 2000 to 2014. And the unfortunate part about narcotics is that for many addicts, it's not because they, it's not an issue of willpower. It's not really an issue of willpower for any type of addiction. But for something like narcotics, how the addiction typically starts is with a pain reliever prescription from a doctor. So the medical industry really has a huge role to play in the opioid crisis that we are still going through, because there's been a generally kind of an overprescription of pain medication, and pain medication is highly addictive. So, people are prescribed pain relief, and it's not too far from an addiction to pain pills to an addiction to heroin, unfortunately. So now we'll move into the conclusions for the day. Today we defined consciousness. Additionally, we learned about the different stages of sleep, and you'll need to know the brain waves associated with these stages. Next, we learned about the different theories of dreams and each issue with these theories. Then we described the different types of drugs, the examples of drugs, and we learned about each one of these drugs' effects. So thank you. That's all I have for you today. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.